So welcome everyone to today's session on alternative assessment. This is hosted by the Learning Design team at the Faculty of Education's Learning Design and Digital Innovation Unit, or LDDI. So we have three wonderful presenters today. So my name is Gabrielle Coombs. I am a learning designer here at LDDI, and I am joined by my wonderful colleagues, Jamili and Kalisa. So I'll pass over to Jamili to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jamili Baroud. My title is Curriculum and Evaluation Consultant, and I will just pass it over to Kalisa.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. My name is Kalisa Young. I'm a learning designer in the LDDI team. We respectfully acknowledge that LDDI is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam and Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh nations. These lands and places are steeped in the histories and knowledge of the original peoples of these territories. The faculty's activities take place on Indigenous lands throughout British Columbia and beyond. And
Thanks, Kalisa. And so we thought we'd share our agenda with you on the outset today. So first, we're going to go over what alternative assessment is, and that will be done by Kalisa. Next, we'll move on to the why. So multiple purposes why we think it might be useful for you to incorporate alternative assessment in your classroom, and that will be done by Gabrielle. And then it'll move on to me, and I will go through some examples of how to implement an alternative assessments inside the classroom. And then we're going to move on to some more concrete examples, so showcasing some ways that it's been done within the Faculty of Education.
great. And so as we dive into what are alternative assessments, we have on the screen, we have a Mentimeter. So feel free to use your phones now, open up your cameras. And the link is also shared in the chat. And please share your ideas through short word responses. So we'll have the QR code on the screen here, and we'll see what are some assessment strategies you feel comfortable using in the classroom.
Mhm.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, and we're just about to dive in. I see, oh, more responses are coming in. Okay. Okay, thank you for the responses. And so these are a few that we're actually going to speak to now as some what we consider to be traditional assessment practices that we've had a part of our educational landscape. So these methods, like old friends, they've been around for a while and they continue to play a significant role in gauging students' learning. So first we have multiple choice tests. These are classic assessment practices that present students with a set of options or prompts, and they must choose the correct answer from a list of options. Next, we might have written assignments, so essays, reports, research paper fall into this category. And so students are able to show their understanding, their critical thinking, and their ability to articulate ideas through written expression. Next, we have oral exams. And I remember as a student, when I had to sit across from the examiner during these oral exams and the high anxiety that ensued, but that is a form of assessment, of course. So their students are able to answer these questions verbally, demonstrating their knowledge, communication skills, and ability to think on their feet. And so there are others, such as discussion and class participation, group projects, and annotated bibliography. And these assessments measure knowledge and understanding. And what we need to remember is that these assignments have stood the test of time, but they're not without limitations. And so while they do provide valuable insights, they may not fully capture the full spectrum of what students' ability account for, and also to take account of UDL and EDID. And so when we are moving forward, what can it look like? What can these alternative assessments look like? We have a book, Designing for Care. And so we can imagine creating better pedagogies. And for this, it starts with the first step in creating a powerful learning environment. And for the authors of this collection, it begins first with humanizing pedagogies online in the classroom where your space is, that really fully embrace the learning environments for people, and that people are fantastic. They're curious, they're unpredictable, they're multi-layered, they're more than capable. And so they dive deeper into what is called hybrid pedagogy, which has three components. And one is diverse expression. And so alternative assignments allow students to demonstrate their understanding through various means, portfolios, presentation, creative assignments. And this flexibility really accommodates for preferences and encourages creativity. Another one is authentic context. And so unlike standardized tests, these alternative assessments often mirror real-world scenarios. So students engage in tasks that resemble professional work and providing a more authentic learning experience. Another is in deeper understanding. So by focusing on application and synthesis, alternative assessment encourage critical thinking. And so students delve into complex problem, analyze information, and construct meaningful responses. The book also highlights this task of on-grading. And so on-grading fosters a sense of community, eliminating competition is how they phrase it. So students collaborated freely without the pressure of group projects or the fear of making mistakes. And another one which is highlighted is risk and feedback, and we'll delve a little bit into feedback here in our presentation. On grading assessment assignments allow students to take risk while receiving valuable feedback. So unlike traditional grading, where grades often hinder growth, on grading encourage exploration. And next one that they looked at was academic safety. One student likened on grading to the creative process, emphasizing that they felt that they could take a risk and without the fear of that academic repercussion. But in this class and in this book in particular, feedback replaced judgment based on grades. And again, we'll dive a little bit more detail in that later on in the workshop. Next, they highlighted reduce anxiety. So traditional exams can induce stress and anxiety. And so alternative assessments with their low stakes nature alleviate this pressure. So students felt less like they were being judged and more like they were actively learning. And finally, the idea of holistic assessment. These assessments considered not only the content knowledge, but also soft skills like communication, collaboration, and creativity. And they provided a more holistic view of the students' abilities. And so when we consider this, the question might come up, does this mean that I need to only use technology? Is this what you're saying? Are you saying to forget about tradition? The short answer is no, but let's consider this. In another book called Learning First, Technology Second, the author, Liz, really emphasizes that there's an intersection of proven teaching strategies with technology tools. So while the book primarily focuses on leveraging technology effectively, it also acknowledges the importance of traditional assessment practices. So the key framework is called the Triple E framework. And so She emphasizes that technology is not only a solo act. You engage students in on-time task learning, you enhance learning beyond the traditional means, and you extend learning opportunities to bridge classroom learning with students' everyday lives. And so in the book, she shares two strategies that really intersect with technology tools. One is called the authentic learning experience. So she shares that how technology can amplify learning experiences beyond the traditional means. She provides effective strategies for using technology to create authentic learning experiences for students, implying that really technology should align with established teaching practices rather than replace them arbitrarily. And next, she talks about she went around and she gathered some case studies that have integrated the technology. And in one class, there was a K to grade 2 French immersion class where they used Google Earth and Google Cardboard to create a scavenger hunt to help scaffold these connections. So while using the Triple E framework, so the students were able to the teachers were able to engage the students by going on this virtual field trip and exploring real locations, enhancing the learning by using Google Earth to provide students with that authentic images of daily life in Paris, and also to extend the students' connections between their everyday experiences and the life of someone living in Paris. So while this book really integrates and reminds us that instructional moves are critical components of a student's success with technology. The book primarily explores technology integration. And so now that we've discussed what it could potentially look like, let's continue to dive into the why. Why should we implement these alternative assessments? And so we have another Mentimeter on screen, and it's asking you the question, why use these alternative assessments? And so here's a QR code. Feel free to share your ideas here, and the link is also provided in the chat.
Thank you. Pardon me. Thank you, Kalisa, for sort of jumping into why, and as people respond, why you might use alternative assessments. I'll sort of read out and see what people are thinking. Options, yep. Oh, yes, boredom, right, definitely. I know that I can not write another essay if I would rather, if I could avoid it, I definitely would. More easily meet needs of diverse learners, accommodate different learning styles for sure. Okay, fantastic. So I'm going to be jumping into why it's worth using alternative assessments, and I'm sort of breaking it down into three main areas. The first one is universal design for learning, which Kalisa did bring up. And in thinking about thinking about assessment, we really are thinking about how using alternative assessment styles can actually better align with the universal design for learning principles that we're trying to engage with in our course design work. The next piece is understanding that alternative assessments do have a role to play as part of the bigger project of equity, diversity, inclusion, and decolonization. And then the last piece is the AI elephant in the room, the advent of generative AI tools, and some of the implications that it's sort of bringing as we are looking at assessment. So we're going to jump into UDL, and I'm sure that UDL is something that's probably quite familiar for folks in this workshop, but I do think that it provides a really good starting point for thinking about the worth or the why of using alternative assessment. So as a quick refresher, UDL follows these three main areas with a focus on providing students with multiple means of engagement. So engagement, we're thinking about a focus on why we learn. So the idea here is how can we keep students engaged and motivated in their learning? It also is about providing multiple means of representation. So this is a focus on the what, the learning content itself. So the idea here is that we're ensuring that students are able to understand and digest their learning. And then finally, with action and expression, which is sort of a focus on the how, the demonstrable learning, thinking about how students can show what they've learned, but also more deeply, it sort of interrogates whether traditional methods of action and expression, such as, the essay, whether these are always the best way to actually demonstrate learning. So I'm going to go into a couple of examples here. So when we're thinking about engagement, we're thinking about the idea of student choice and voice. So when designing an assessment, it's good to think about how we can optimize the relevance, authenticity, agency, and autonomy of our students. So the more choices and options for sort of personalization that we provide to students with their assessments, the more engaged they're going to be. If we're thinking about representation, this is more on the instructor end. So when you're thinking about, again, designing an assessment, thinking about, how can I offer instruction or even feedback, maybe in different modalities or in ways that, again, are going to really humanize the learning experience, as Kalisa was mentioning earlier, and include students. And again, sort of give them some choice and voice as well. And then finally, with action and expression, this is thinking about, students being able to use modalities and formats which suit their needs and interests. As Kalisa said, students are multifaceted, interesting, with like a diversity of experiences. So students, if we give them multiple means of access, action and expression, pardon me, they can leverage sort of other skills that they may already have and demonstrate their learning through means accessible to them. So for example, if you have a student who maybe has a video editing background, giving them the option of, say, a video essay versus a written essay might keep them a little bit more engaged and provide them with a modality that's going to keep them very motivated and engaged in their learning. Similarly, say if you had a student with a visual impairment, they might want to produce a podcast or an audio format instead of something that's written. So UDL, again, as I said, is a really good starting point, but as has sort of been accepted not only by a lot of folks using UDL, but by by CAST, the organization which originally developed the framework, UDL is pretty lacking in terms of equity, diversity, inclusion, and decolonization. And so alternative assessment through an EDID lens recognizes and seeks to support non-traditional students. And we're definitely living in a time where there are more and more non-traditional students than ever in our post-secondary spaces. So when we talk about non-traditional students, what we mean by that is a student or students who historically have not had access to institutions of higher learning for a myriad of reasons. And often students whose ways of knowing have not always been considered or valued as part of our pedagogy and practice. So this could be, for example, students from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. So that could be Indigenous students, students who don't speak English as their first language, or international students. It could also be queer students, so students who have diverse sexual orientations or gender identities. It could be students with varying abilities, students with disabilities, and then students also who have maybe really limited access to time, resources, and money. So if you think, for example, of maybe an online master's student, they might be doing their master's degree online because they work full time. They might also be doing it online because they can't afford to live in Vancouver. Vancouver is a very expensive city to live in. So considering that we have these non-traditional students, we really need to start thinking about how can we best support them to succeed in this environment. to do that, we sort of have to accept that the existing systems that we're working within and the traditional practices of assessing learning have historically, again, really rejected and othered diverse expressions of knowledge. So this could be, for example, with, written expressions of knowledge, like the essay being overly valued or valued more than, say, a spoken or a drawn expression of knowledge. And so with this EDID work, what we're looking to do, really in terms of developing assessments, is that we want to recognize and honor students' autonomy, self-determination, and diverse lived experiences. So again, non-traditional students have really valuable perspectives that they can leverage to show how their learning relates to them, their practice, and their future work. We also want to make sure that we're including students by providing equitable access to knowledge, tools, technologies, and decision-making. So with this, we're thinking about, do students have a voice and choice in their learning? If we're using a technology, are we asking them to use something, first of all, that they have access to? Do they need to pay for it? And if they do, can they afford to use it? And are we supporting them in learning how to use that tool? Another thing to consider also is that we want to be valuing the demonstration of learning over how the learning is demonstrated. So what we mean by that is that we really want to be assessing what students have learned, their demonstration of learning, rather than the end product, or, for example, the modality it was presented, or how perfect their grammar is in their essay, unless that's the point of the assignment. Or, valuing written expressions of knowledge over an oral presentation or a graphic or something like that. The final piece here really as well is that we need to understand that the goal of EDID work, especially in education, is that we are pursuing justice, we're pursuing the removal of barriers, and we're trying to change the systems, these traditional systems which have excluded people in the past. So if we're going to be committed to EDID work, then we must in turn sort of decentralize these traditional Eurocentric ideas and assessment techniques about, and think thoughts about what learning really means, and think more creatively and critically about how learning can be demonstrated. So these are all really important pieces, but then we have kind of an agitator with AI. So I know that we've all been alive over the last 18 months. We know that AI is here, and we know that the panic that has happened has sort of permeated our culture here for a while with, you can see here some pretty inflammatory headlines. This one from The Atlantic, "The college essay is dead." So it's a little dramatic, but quite anxiety inducing as well for people who work in education, because it's presented us with a situation where a lot of the techniques that we're used to using might not cut it anymore. So with AI, we want to make sure that we understand that a lot of traditional assessment strategies, things like essays or posts responding to a very theoretical prompt in a discussion forum, for example, can be very easily replicated using generative AI tools such as ChatGPT. But if we want to give assessments which give opportunities for our students to personalize their work, to share their lived experiences, connect to their own practices, this is going to be a lot harder to replicate with artificial intelligence. And these tools have some pretty amazing abilities and value. So AI presents us with this cool new opportunity to develop students' critical digital literacy skills. We know AI is here to stay, and it is likely that a lot of our students are going to be entering the workforce with the expectation that they know how to use these tools. So not to say that you must use AI, but that it is an option that we can use as part of our alternative assessment practices. So this is a lot. There are a lot of pieces here. And I can understand as well from the instructor's point of view, we all have limited time and we have a lot of, ideas. And sometimes it can be difficult to make the jump from switching from traditional assessment strategies to alternative assessments. So we wanted to kind of gauge what stops people, what maybe stops you or gives you anxiety about implementing alternative assessments before we dive into some ways that you can do so. So we'll move over to our Mentimeter. Jamelia has kindly shared the link in our chat. And I will hand over to Jamelia to have a look at some of these responses.
Thank you, Gabby. I'm eager to see what these responses are. Fear of novelty. It's relatable, certainly. Yeah, time, absolutely. Okay, good. We will definitely tackle time, at least to some extent in this next piece of the presentation. I'll just wait a few more seconds here in case we have any more ideas pop in. The need for students to achieve certain credentials. Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to chat about that a little bit as well. Certainly a hurdle and not an easy one to solve. Comfort with traditional assessment. Yeah, we certainly fall into those practices, especially when our entire course is kind of designed with those traditional assessments. It can be very overwhelming knowing kind of where to start. So I can relate to that. Awesome. Thank you all so much. Okay. Thank you both, Clesa and Gabrielle. You've set me up perfectly to delve into the how. So, of course, we want to talk about how to incorporate alternative assessment, but as we discussed, we also really want to showcase how to balance alternative assessment for reporting and learning, because that can be one of the kind of biggest challenges. And although we may know based on, research and perhaps through this presentation that traditional assessment and grading practices aren't always a good reflection of student learning and growth, can be stressful and can certainly exacerbate existing academic inequalities, we may not always be able to or want to eliminate traditional assessment and grading in our specific teaching context for a variety of reasons. But what we can do is provide solutions to trace student growth over time, hold back maybe some grading, and assess for how students are making progress and how they engage in learning. So we will showcase how to do that today. Another piece to kind of understand, which you've already mentioned in your responses to our Mentimeter, is, if we're teaching differently, then we have to assess differently. And to do that, we will invite you to design assessments that directly support student learning first, with technology and evaluation considered secondarily, as Kalisa had mentioned earlier. So as a guide, we've compiled some options for creating assessment activities that are learning focused, while also being equitable and designed for care. We've loosely grouped these suggestions by expected time commitment. We know that time is such a huge issue, and include either kind of incremental changes, so smaller changes that might take less time, or course redesign changes, which may take a bit more time. So in all cases, the suggestions are meant to support you to design your course assessment based on your course learning objectives, and to use intentional and deliberate planning to create a course that best supports student learning. So first, we're going to talk about these incremental changes. So perhaps those incremental changes as an iterative process within your course. So where the evaluation of student performance encourages you to make more minor adjustments to activities and assessments along the way. So kind of bite-sized pieces that you can start doing right away and kind of incorporate as you go. So in other words, the assessment practices in this section can be implemented in any class without substantial redesign. And we'd like to start with choice and flexibility. So we might invite you to consider choosing activities and assignments that interweave interdisciplinary topics. And when possible, ask students to choose a topic of interest or a topic they're passionate about for the assignment or task, so that they're able to engage with the content in a more meaningful way and connect that course content to their lived experiences and professional contexts, as Gabrielle had mentioned earlier. So for example, while assigning a discussion post is completely fine, we invite you to ask your students to maybe choose the reading they want to respond to choose the modality they respond with, so potentially audio, written, video, a graphic, and to make connections to their lived experiences and professional contacts, and to make that a requirement. And in terms of flexibility, it's also important to consider removing timed quizzes and exams, and perhaps even incorporate more open book exams and quizzes to lessen that anxiety and that stress that's often associated with those timed exams. Also, perhaps to allow retakes of all or some assignments, to drop the lowest grade in a category of assignments, or substitute a test grade for a final exam grade. Okay, now we're going to move to guides for students. So in terms of guides, you could invite students to co-construct the rubric, which we really advocate for. Or if you create the rubric, share it and review it with the students before the assignment is due. Also, grade students in comparison to standardized performance goals rather than in comparison to each other. Or prepare a structured marking sheet with checklists and guidelines for all assignments rather than use a rubric. And include those for the assignments that you're assigning and grading, but also for peer or self-assessment so that students can really have a structured way to say, okay, yes, I've got this done, I've got 2 done, I've got 3 done. And so they know really have a structured format to ensure that they have kind of the best grade that they can possibly receive. And when assessing reflective work, so work that asks students to kind of reflect on their own work or their own personal experiences or professional contexts, or technological submissions, so asking students to use a new tech tool, only evaluate the content, not the digital product. And this is especially important if you're teaching students to use a new tool while also asking them to learn new content, because we want to be able to balance that cognitive overload for students. We also suggest providing exemplars, especially for those major tasks worth high percentages, to demystify the task and provide some structure for students who might feel that kind of heightened stress about an assignment they've never seen before. Okay, and we're going to move towards opportunities for practice. So we would encourage you to include practice assignments that are aligned with the types of things students will be graded on and make the connection explicit. So this could be, ungraded practice tests, sample essays or portions of essays, mock debates, or other kind of relevant practice activities. Also, scaffolding larger assignments. So, for example, you could break down those larger assignments into smaller pieces with instructions and feedback provided after each portion is submitted. And then that way, you're not assigning a massive assignment worth kind of 50% of a student's grade, which can really be quite highly stressful. But instead, each smaller task is worth less. And students also get the chance to master the skill before submitting the final product. You could also include more formative, ungraded assessment opportunities in line with that scaffolding, or offer a larger number of lower stakes assignments instead of a few higher stakes assignments. You could also provide opportunities to practice using the technologies that will be assessed later on in the course so that students are comfortable using the tools before being graded on them. So for instance, if you're asking a student to submit a video podcast as a final task, it might be important throughout the course then to have smaller assignments that tie in, audio recording, video recording, perhaps storyboarding that podcast assignment. Okay, there's also opportunities for students to reflect on their learning and progress. So we're moving towards reflections here. So one option is actually to use interviews. So you could ask students to explain, how they got the answer they did, what their thought process was, what resources they used to respond to the assignment, potentially how the assignment connects to prior learning in your course or earlier courses, and how they felt when they were working on the assignment or other reflective work. And you could provide written or verbal feedback instead of or in addition to a score or letter grade, and invite students to reflect on and respond to the feedback that you give them. So in terms of course learning objectives and student learning, we invite you to iteratively review and revise your assessments. So you might be not sure where to go from your syllabus today. What you could do is share with students how the assessments went and then get their feedback about whether the assessment accurately reflected their learning. And then reflect and make notes for yourself about how to improve the assessment in the future to better align with the course learning objectives and to better support student learning. Okay, so those are just a few incremental changes we could begin to implement today. And so then we'll move on to some maybe more major course redesign and revision. So the approaches in this section either need kind of intensive course design work, which could be very time consuming, or may need to be incorporated as part of a larger discussion about assessment within a department, program, or even institution. So we do understand these might be a little bit less realistic, but still ways to move forward in our courses if they become realistic to us. So one option is to use ungrading, which is an approach in which individual assignments are not given numerical or letter grades. There are many reasons why to incorporate ungrading, but ultimately, if we're asking students to try new tech tools and try new forms of assessment activities, new to you and new to them, if we incorporate grades, that often leads students to avoid taking academic risks, like Kalisa was mentioning earlier, which could be very counterproductive to the educational goal. Another item we could do is incorporate kind of authentic assessment. So like Gabrielle had mentioned, redesigning a course with assessments based on real world problems and issues, and think about incorporating methodologies that are actually used in your discipline. Next is feedback. So this might be a bit more simple to incorporate regardless of the course context, but offer significantly more feedback to students on their work and offer that feedback in multimodal ways. So instead of always providing written feedback, try audio or video-based feedback instead. Alternatively, you could do more one-on-one coaching and host interviews with students to facilitate learning. Okay, and last but not least, we're moving on towards contracts. So you could use learning contracts or individualized learning goals and learning plans. So learning contracts outline behaviors and habits for success and can promote student reflection on their learning progress and their growth. So these contracts might include students' goals in the course, how to achieve those goals, identify potential challenges to achieve those goals, and then have those students identify strategies to overcome those goals. So kind of like a learning plan within the course. Alternatively, you could use something called contract grading. So there are many types of grading contracts, but basically contract grading decouples evaluation from grades and instead gives students grades based on their work or labor in the course. So that could include completing homework assignments, attending and participating in class, turning in assignments, drafts and revisions on time. But there are also grading contracts that kind of permit students to choose the grade that they hope to achieve at the onset of the course, and then work with the instructor to achieve that goal. So for instance, if a student really wanted to achieve an A in that course, have a discussion with you about how might they achieve that A in the course. And if they're submitting B plus work, then having an interview at that point in time and having a discussion about how they might be able to, change the things that they're doing to be able to receive that A. And perhaps that could include within that grading contract, dropping one of the assignments where they received a poorer grade, or substituting an assignment. So you can see here, there's like a blend of ideas that you could incorporate within the alternative assessment how-tos. Okay, so next, we put together some kind of easy swaps for alternative assessment. And then afterwards, we're going to showcase some more concrete examples of assignment from different courses. But let's start with the traditional essay. So if typically you assign a traditional essay in your course, you could alternatively assign a comic book. I know that there is actually a comic book thesis that was published at Simon Fraser University, and this was years ago now. But the student had asked, instead of submitting a very formal thesis, could they submit a comic book thesis? And it's so beautiful. It incorporates a lot of the rich data, but visuals at the same time. And the language is also far more digestible, so it reaches a broader audience. So just to say that this is happening at multiple levels within institutions. So a comic book could be great. Also a photo essay to show storytelling. So you could do something like a Pachacucha, where you're also asking students to really work on condensing their language and condensing the format. So they have 20 seconds and 20 sides per second to tell their story. And typically you just use visuals. So that's another option. Then we also have the classic quiz. So I just want to reiterate that you can also just kind of remove having timed quizzes, which might also be a form of alternative assessment. But you could also introduce some scenario or case-based studies so that students are actually working with and providing solutions to very real-world problems, or even do something like an interactive narrative. An interactive narrative would be a student kind of using a tech tool to create a story and then having different options for like a choose your own adventure. So the reader of that story could then choose, option A or option B, and that story would take you somewhere differently depending on your response. And then we have the exam, another reiteration that you could just eliminate timed exams. Also, though, you could use an open booked exam, and that would be a form of alternative assessment. But alternatively, you could use, a one-on-one interview. So if a student doesn't feel particularly strong in their writing skills, for instance, an interview might be a better way to evaluate that student's learning and growth in your course. You could also do oral presentations, or again, integrate that podcast. I want to reiterate here that if you are introducing a podcast or oral presentation, this would be a really good opportunity to use that scaffolding. So scaffolding that podcast into smaller segments throughout the course so that students have the opportunity to showcase their learning through the growth of the course, and submit something they can be proud of. All right. And so now we are moving towards some concrete examples. I think I'm passing it on to Gabrielle. Perfect.
Thank you, Jamili. So with these examples, we've sort of chosen an array of different assessments, from sort of low tech through to sort of more high tech options. So the first one is a zine and presentation task. So this is actually taken from a course ECD 565 that was run by Dr. Iris Berger last summer. And a zine is short for a magazine. If you've never heard of them, they're a sort of self-published booklet that's generally used often in activist spaces as a means of sort of disseminating ideas and information in creative ways, especially ideas which might not be able to make the leap to more mainstream sort of publication options. So the goal with this was for students to create a zine with the idea that they would be engaging with sort of arts-based pedagogies, but also giving them an opportunity to sort of be creative and demonstrate their learning. And then alongside the zine, what they also did was a short presentation where they would showcase their artifact, their work, but then also sort of justify the creative choices that they made, link to the sort of like theories that had been presented in the course content and some of their own research. And I think, this is a pretty low tech option. You don't have to use any computers or anything for this kind of task. You could just use some paper, provide maybe some old newspapers and magazines so that they can cut things up and stick them in, using, pencils or pens or something like that. That being said, if you wanted to do this in an online environment, you could definitely get students to make a zine and then take photos of it to display their work. So this could be a really fun way to incorporate a little bit of creativity and just another modality of demonstrating learning. I think the next one is something Khalees is going to tell us about, the choice board.
Yeah, so another example is using choice boards. And really, choice board is about empowering student choice. It gives a student power to choose how they want to share their knowledge. It's like saying, hey, you can write an essay, you can make a video, or you can do an interpretive dance. It really is your call. Think of it as assessment variety. I think of it as a buffet of assessment options, but although that more sounds like lunchtime, it is that multimodal approach that we've been talking about. So those creative projects, just as Gabrielle and Jimmy were mentioning, creating a video or even a dramatic Shakespearean reenactment, complete, of course, with accents, of course, student choice. We also think about it as an engagement boost. So when students have a say in their learning, they're more invested. So it's like giving them that backstage pass to that educational concert or context. And of course, there's a flexibility. So whether you're in class, whether you're in person, whether you're hybrid, the choice board really adapts to, it's like a chameleon. So it's like saying, hey, you can be a PDF, hey, you can be a Google Doc, hey, you can be a podcast. It really is saying, it's really given that sense that the world is your oyster.
Okay, and this is an example from Dr. Natasha Boschkik's class in eTech 524. We wanted to showcase this because Natasha opted to provide oral feedback to her students rather than the standard text-based feedback in her online course. And we had mentioned this and then had this example and thought this was such a beautiful response from her student. And it didn't really, I mean, of course, this is laborious work, not to say it's not difficult work, but a very easy and simple assessment swap. So we wanted to share this quote that a student wrote because we thought it was really quite powerful for such a simple adjustment within her course. So the student wrote, I know you can all read, but I'll read it out loud really quickly. I really appreciated receiving feedback this way. Here are my thoughts. It was much more thorough and detailed than a written response would have been. It felt much more organic. You were talking to us. Sometimes written feedback feels like we're being talked at, challenging and extending our thoughts, offering lots of great constructive criticism. I enjoyed hearing you talk through the paper. It felt logical and chronological, had a flow, and felt more like a stream of consciousness slash conversation rather than dry feedback. All of this helped me follow the feedback better and to nod along whenever you've asked a question that we asked ourselves as a team. For example, having fewer columns in the rubric, shortening the context, wondering whether something was an LMS requirement or a teaching requirement. Not being an auditory person, I thought it would be harder for me to absorb audio feedback, but I was pleasantly surprised when it actually was easier and more pleasant. So thank you for that experience. I should also highlight here that Natasha invited her students to respond to her feedback, which we had also mentioned earlier in the presentation. So we thought this was a lovely example.
We have another example, and this is a more sort of higher tech option, which would be using the collaborative learning annotation system or class, which is a UBC supported annotation tool. So what it does is it allows for students and instructors to annotate PDFs, videos, and images. And this is being used quite a bit across the Faculty of Education. I've seen it used for peer review for video essays. It can be used for the annotation of course readings. I've seen it used for the annotation of really visual media like videos or graphic novels in one case to highlight the sort of features and the forms of that text type. And the really nice thing about this tool is that the annotations can be done in multiple modalities. So I have a screen cap on the slide, which shows a video that's been annotated, and the annotation is me annotating in video format as well. So again, we're providing lots of modalities for students, but also a sort of more interactive and collaborative way of learning content, and in terms of assessment too, giving them that option to do things in a collaborative way. And then our final example, Jamily.
All right, we're going to move on to an AI example. And this is from Dr. Danny Backen's class in EDCP, what are we, 305, and it's a digital media arts class. So we really wanted to showcase this activity because we thought the learning objectives were really rich. You know, not only were students asked to kind of learn how to play with a new tech tool as a learning objective, but they were also asked to grapple with kind of the ethical, safety, and privacy implications of AI simultaneously. And then in terms of the task, we really liked this one because it provided three different choices. And the first choice was if students felt comfortable after learning about the ethical, safety, and privacy implications of AI to use AI, then they certainly could. So they were asked to create an AI project and post a link to it on their weekly discussion board, and then view and comment on at least two of those AI projects. So if you chose AI, then you could create a visual or audio rendering. So it could be static or dynamic, a song, a poem, 2D image, short story. But if students were not comfortable using AI after they learned about those ethical implications, then they could also choose to write a paper about how AI influences creative arts in the present or the future. But even more importantly, because if I was given an option to write an essay or to play with I would choose AI even if I really wasn't comfortable using it. So they also gave that playfulness choice within option B. So students could also create a visual, so a song, poem, 2D image, video about the challenges and opportunities of integrating AI in creative arts. So it's a lovely blending of that kind of, artistic piece, but also that critical digital literacy piece. Oh,
Okay.
great.
So that sort of brings us to the end of our presentation, and we do have a few minutes now for any questions or comments. So if you have any ideas about alternative assessment or a few questions, please come to us now. You can ask questions in the chat. You can use the raise hand function on Zoom, or you can simply unmute yourself and start speaking, whichever modality works for you. Okay, I don't know if we have, we have a question in the chat. Where can I find more options for alternative assessment? That is a great question. So the LDDI website, which is our unit's website, has a variety of different assessment examples. I might get Jamelia or Kalisa, maybe you can put a link in the chat. So we have quite a few different sections of our website. So if you're looking, say, for example, for an AI-related task, we have something called the AI Corner, which has a bunch of different resources, not just for assessment, but just for AI more broadly. But within that, there are a few different AI-related tasks. We do also have a section on our website dedicated to EDID, which again has some suggestions for assessments there. And then we also have a design section in our website, which has a list of different options for assessments that come from courses that are within the faculty, which you can peruse and take a look at. But the other option too, if you're interested, is you can always get in touch with us. Myself, Jamili, and Kalisa are always open for a chat if you're interested in integrating some alternative assessment practices into your course. Okay. Do we have any other questions? That's a good question. So I got one in the chat. Are there equity issues around giving so many individual choices for assessment? Susan, that's a really good question, and something that I think between the three of us, we can probably answer some of, but maybe not completely. I think it depends on sort of what when you're thinking about equity, what the sort of goal of the assessment is. And so I know for you, coming from like the English Language Institute, giving that many options might not be possible, especially, I know we've talked a lot about different modalities, but if the focus is on developing writing skills, there's not really a lot of room to move around with modality. So that could be something that could be a bit of a hindrance, I think. Jamelia, Kalisa, do you have any ideas in terms of like equity issues around sort of giving a lot of choices to students?
Yeah, I used to work a lot with a student who had Asperger's, and for that particular student, too many choices was very overwhelming for them and often made them feel quite stuck in terms of decision making. So I think it really does depend on the students in your course, of course, and in treating each student kind of individually within that case. And in his case, two options was enough, and then he could make a very firm decision, and that was good for him. So I see that there are limitations in terms of equity, absolutely. Also, I think it's fair to say that if you're asking a student to use AI, and there's they're using ChatGPT 4 and it's a $20 cost a month versus a student who doesn't have access to that. I could see that there could be an issue there in terms of the content that could be generated based on that, or even asking them to use a new tech tool. So I think oftentimes in the courses that I'm teaching, when I ask students to, fiddle with different tools, I make sure that those tools are free. So within those options, the ranges of those options are the free options only. So if I was going to assign a ChatGPT assignment, it would only be using that free tool and not extending beyond and using a paid tool, so that we at least, bridge that equity gap to some extent. But I could see this going on for days in terms of digital access divides, so even Wi-Fi and other things like that. So I don't have an answer to how to bridge those gaps necessarily, but the one thing that I'm doing in my class now is just ensuring that anything I'm assigning tech-wise is free to students regardless. But that's a really great question.
There's a sort of follow-up as well. I was thinking more in terms of all students having to meet a certain standard at the end of a course. So that's a really good point too. I mean, especially in like spaces where we have like standardized testing or particular requirements, like they have to meet this particular grade in order to, proceed to the next stage. That does sort of, as I think Jamila, you really touched on, that there are those sort of institutional and like sort of institution cultural barriers that can sort of make this more difficult. I think for me, and again, Kalisa and Jamila jump in as well, but the goal really is thinking about like how are they demonstrating their learning rather than how are they meeting that standard. And like is the standardized test like the only way that they can do that? Again, understanding that there are those sort of like extraneous like those factors like what is required or mandated by the institution. Kalisa, Jamila, any other ideas?
I think and I like that a lot. I think especially in terms of like I'm thinking about my sister who has dyslexia, even in like an English language arts class, I think having the opportunity to have a conversation with an instructor versus writing a paper, to be able to, even if she did write that paper, to be able to express herself verbally, to share what she meant to write in that paper, even if the writing wasn't particularly well, just so that she felt like her ideas were being heard and the content of her ideas was being critiqued in addition to, the quality of her writing. So I think there's ways to kind of blend these activities as well and provide, different options for different students for that reason.
Totally.
Mhm.
I think as well, I have an example from like an ELT perspective as well. So a few years ago, I designed or worked on like a redesign for a hospitality English course. And the final assessment originally had been a multiple choice exam. And when we were redesigning it, I just sort of thought, in what context are students going into the hospitality industry ever going to have to use a multiple choice exam? Is that really an accurate demonstration of their learning? And so we actually ended up changing it to a role play where they had to role play the language skills that they were using. And we did a peer assessment as well as part of that redesign so that they would their peers would also assess, like whether they had used their language correctly. Obviously, we also had instructors being able to, have input there too. But again, it was sort of coming down to what is the standard that we need to meet and what is going to best serve students at the end of the day. I mean, like that multiple choice exam might have demonstrated that they paid attention in class, but it wasn't them actually demonstrating their ability to use language. It was them being able to circle A, B, C, or D. And so again, just thinking about, like obviously there are limitations in terms of standards, but like what is really the sort of most accurate demonstration of learning, I think is a good sort of place to be from.
It's a great question, Susan. Thanks.
Okay, so we're definitely a little over time. We would like to say thank you very much for coming. We do have a few upcoming workshops and events. So if you're interested, we have some amazing in-focus sessions on climate justice coming up. We are also delving deeper into artificial intelligence with our high tea with AI sessions that are happening over the months. We'll have our next one on the 27th of February in person. Again, more climate justice pieces, so check out our website. And if you'd like to connect with us, we would really encourage you to do so. You can send us an email, subscribe to our mailing list. We have LinkedIn, or book a one-on-one consultation. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.